I thought I knew my wife, until I discovered the shocking truth she'd been hiding for over a decade. What I uncovered changed everything and set me on a path I never saw coming. I was the first man my wife had ever been with, and for 10 years, I believed our marriage was solid. Everything seemed perfect, until one day, my friends dropped a truth bomb that shattered my world. They told me that for all those years, Alice had been betraying me in ways I never could have imagined. At first, I refused to believe it. I thought they were either lying or had misunderstood something. But later, when I saw the evidence for myself, I couldn't deny it. Cameras don't lie. Let me walk you through how everything unfolded. Alice and I first crossed paths in 9th grade. We didn't waste much time. By sophomore year, we were officially a couple, and before long, we were that couple at school, the one everyone knew about. We had no major issues back then. It was like something out of one of those high school romance movies. We even shared our first intimate moment on prom night. That evening brought us closer than ever before, and from that point on, we found every opportunity to stay connected in the same way. By junior year, marriage was already part of our conversations. The plan was simple: graduate college and then get married. But college had a way of changing things, Alice especially. Back in high school, everyone respected what we had. The other guys kept their distance because they knew she was with me. But college was a different world entirely. Most people there didn't know who we were or what we shared. To them, Alice was just another attractive girl on campus. And boy, did she catch a lot of attention from the guys. At first, I noticed but tried not to overthink it. What could I do anyway? Our schedules didn't align. We barely had time together since we had separate classes, and I worked evening shifts. The only time we got to spend together was late at night, after both of us were done for the day. But that constant attention Alice received slowly started changing her. She became more extroverted and, to my surprise, more flirtatious. I'd catch her chatting and laughing with guys around campus, sometimes from a distance where she couldn't see me watching. Once or twice, it happened across the quad, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy gnawing at me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but those little moments started adding up, and eventually, they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, I was walking past the student union and noticed Alice sitting in the cafeteria. She wasn't alone, a guy was with her, and another one joined shortly after. Thinking back on it now, I realize I never saw her hanging out with other girls. It was always guys. But at the time, I didn't read too much into it. I trusted her. We were in love, planning a future together. That love felt unbreakable, as if nothing could come between us. Alice was mine, or so I believed. Every night we spent together reinforced that illusion. Alice was stunning, and the attention she got from other guys was something I figured we just had to put up with. I didn't view it as a real threat. After all, we had a history. She always came back to me, and that meant something. After we both graduated, life unfolded just as we'd planned. We found steady jobs, tied the knot, and started what I thought was a perfect life. For nearly 6 years, I lived in that blissful bubble, convinced everything was going great. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, my world came crashing down. It all began on a regular Thursday afternoon at work. Sophie, the employee from the mailroom, came by to deliver a stack of files. Among them was one that didn't even belong to me. It was Derek Porter's. Derek was an old friend from both high school and college. I wasn't planning to snoop, but as I skimmed through the file, a glaring error caught my eye. Nearly $3 million was unaccounted for. I was preparing to fix it when Derek burst into my office, looking like he was about to have a meltdown. "Man, I need that file," he said, panicked. "I'm presenting to Apex, and I can't afford any mistakes." I pointed out the massive error, and he almost collapsed from relief. "You saved my life," he said, grabbing the file. He thanked me over and over before running off to make the corrections in time for his meeting. That evening, as was my routine on Thursdays, I headed to Bud's bar for a burger and a couple of beers. Alice was working late on payroll for Friday's checks, so I had some time to kill. I was halfway through my second beer when Derek walked in. He noticed me, came straight over, and slid into my booth. "Hey, I owe you one," he said, ordering a drink and insisting on covering my tab as a thank you for earlier. We got to talking, mostly about work at first, and then the conversation shifted to catching up on mutual friends from our college days. Everything felt normal until Derek blindsided me with a question I never saw coming. "So, why do you put up with Alice's behavior?" he asked, his tone casual but the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. I froze, completely taken aback. "What do you mean by that?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. I asked him what he meant, completely confused. Derek froze for a moment, his eyes darting around like he was trying to find an escape. He quickly realized I was in the dark about whatever he was hinting at. "Forget I said anything," he mumbled, making a move to leave. But I wasn't about to let it go. I reached out, stopping him mid-step. "Hold on, Derek. You don't drop something like that and walk away," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You need to explain. Now." He hesitated for what felt like an eternity, then finally sighed and sank back into the booth, his expression full of regret. "Man. I didn't want to be the one to tell you this," he said quietly. And that's when he shattered my entire reality. Derek revealed that Alice had a reputation, a bad one. It wasn't just something that had started recently, either. According to him, it went all the way back to high school. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, but before I could fully process what he was saying, Derek's next confession hit even harder. He admitted that he had been involved with her himself. I stared at him in stunned disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked, my voice low and shaky. "I'm sorry," he said, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "It was right after prom. I walked in on her with someone else, and instead of leaving, I got pulled into it." He shook his head, as if ashamed of the memory. I felt like I was spinning, barely able to keep up with what he was saying. "You mean to tell me this has been going on for years? You've known all this time?" Derek nodded reluctantly and began to recount everything, his words spilling out like a broken dam. He explained how this wasn't a one-time incident. Alice had been sneaking around throughout high school. Guys would come and go, sometimes at parties, sometimes in between classes. The pattern didn't stop when we went to college. Despite the changes in her schedule each semester, her so-called extracurricular activities continued. It wasn't an everyday thing, but according to Derek, it happened regularly, 2 or 3 times a week. I sat there frozen, each detail hitting me harder than the last. 10 years. 10 years of betrayal. All of it had been right under my nose, and I never saw it. Derek tried to offer some sort of excuse. "Look, man, we weren't that close back then," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "And honestly, I didn't think you and Alice were serious. I figured you probably knew, or maybe didn't care." But his excuses meant nothing to me. The only thing running through my mind was how blind I had been. All those times I trusted her, ignored my gut, and dismissed the signs, it all made sense now. No wonder people reacted strangely when Alice and I announced our marriage. Some probably assumed I was aware of her past. Others might have thought I didn't care, that I was somehow fine with all the attention she got. Derek paused before adding one more thing. "For what it's worth. I stopped sleeping with her after you got married. I mean, a single woman is one thing, but a married one. That's different." His words echoed in my ears, but I was too numb to react. My thoughts were spinning out of control, a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and humiliation. I couldn't speak. I couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight of betrayal. But one thing became crystal clear in that moment: I couldn't turn a blind eye to this anymore. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. I drained the last of my beer, stood up, and gave Derek a nod. "Thanks, for the drink and for the truth," I said bitterly. My voice was hollow, the weight of his words still crushing me. The drive home blurred together in a fog of unanswered questions. Could I really believe him? Part of me didn't want to. This was Alice, the woman I'd known and loved since high school. But another part of me whispered that he wasn't lying. If I'd been in Derek's shoes and Alice had made a move on me back then, I might have fallen for it too. But this wasn't about a single mistake. This was a decade of betrayal. 10 years of lies. By the time I got home, Alice was already there, having finished her work on payroll for the night. She greeted me casually, like everything was normal. Later, as we got into bed, she reached out to me, her hand brushing my shoulder. That simple touch made my skin crawl. For the first time, I felt absolutely nothing, no desire, no love, no connection. I couldn't bear to face her, so I rolled onto my side and pretended to be asleep. My mind kept racing, making it impossible to rest. The next morning, I woke early. I busied myself by brewing coffee and skimming through the newspaper, trying to steady my thoughts. It was no use. I needed advice from someone who could help me make sense of this mess. I reached out to Rob, an old friend who had gone through a messy divorce a few years back. When he answered the phone and I hesitantly brought up the situation, his response stopped me cold. "If you're asking me about this, I guess you finally found out," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. My stomach dropped. "Yeah. I found out last night," I admitted, still reeling from how casually he'd confirmed it. After a brief pause, Rob recommended a divorce lawyer named Jack McAdam and told me to mention his name when I called. Without wasting any time, I contacted McAdam and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. By 1 p.m., I was sitting in McAdam's office, laying out the nightmare I was trapped in. He listened carefully, then walked me through my legal options. They ranged from a peaceful, amicable separation to a full-blown scorched earth approach. I didn't know which path I wanted to take yet. All I knew was that I needed a plan. McAdam warned me that, from now on, I'd have to act like nothing had changed. "Alice can't suspect a thing," he cautioned. "As hard as it might be, you need to keep up appearances. Stick to your routines. If she senses that something's off, you'll lose control of the situation." Everything inside me rebelled against the idea of pretending. I didn't want to live this lie for another second, but I knew he was right. I had to play the part, at least for now, while I figured out my next steps. That night, I tried to maintain our normal routine. Our Friday night dinners had always been a cornerstone of our relationship, or at least I'd thought so. I casually suggested that we go out to a restaurant for dinner, and Alice agreed without hesitation. Her voice was cheerful, almost too natural, like she didn't have a care in the world. I hated how convincing she sounded, as if nothing was wrong. At dinner, I barely touched my chicken marsala, pushing the food around my plate. Across from me, Alice sipped her white wine and chatted casually, her fork twirling through a plate of rigatoni. I could hardly focus on her words. Every smile, every laugh felt like an act, a cruel facade hiding the truth I now knew. I forced myself to nod, to engage in small talk, all the while seething inside. I had to live this charade a little longer. The truth was unraveling everything I thought I knew about our life together, and soon, there would be no going back. I forced myself to act normal throughout dinner, laughing at Alice's jokes and smiling at the right moments, even though inside I felt like a volcano on the verge of eruption. I just wanted to get through the night without tipping her off. Afterward, I suggested we go out for drinks or maybe even dancing. Part of me thought it might delay going home, give me more time to think. Or maybe I just wanted to keep her guessing. But Alice wasn't interested. "Nah, let's just head home," she said, flashing a sly grin. You owe me for last night. Her teasing caught me off guard. During the drive back, she slid closer to me in the car, her hand drifting to places that made my stomach tighten, not from desire, but from disgust. Drive careful, sweetie, she whispered seductively, her voice like honey. Wouldn't want you to bite off something important. Her casual confidence made me sick. It was a grim reminder of the double life she'd been living. That night wasn't about love or connection, it was just an empty performance. And unfortunately, once wasn't enough for Alice. She wanted more. I went through the motions again, feeling trapped in a dark, endless play. By the time she finally let me sleep, I felt completely drained, emotionally and physically. The next morning, I was up before her, lacing up my running shoes and trying to clear my mind. As I stretched in the kitchen, Alice wandered in, casually mentioning that she wouldn't be home when I got back. I have a hair appointment, she said. It's a long one, 9 to 2. I nodded, forcing indifference into my voice. Okay, see you later. After my 5-mile run, I returned home and headed straight to the basement. Hidden above my workbench, tucked inside a cabinet, were the recorders Nelson's team had installed. One device captured audio from the phone taps and listening devices, the other recorded video from the hidden cameras. My hands trembled as I powered them on and pressed play. The first thing I heard was Alice's voice, bright and sweet, as if she were talking to an old friend. Hello, she said. Good morning, lover. Are we still on for today? A man's voice responded confidently. You bet. Alice laughed, a laugh so genuine and carefree it was as if she were with someone she truly cherished. I stood there, numb, the sound of their conversation clawing at my insides. How many lies had she told? How many people I knew had played a part in this betrayal? When Alice finally returned from her hair appointment, I had just barely composed myself. I even staged a fall down the basement stairs to sell the excuse I'd thought up. I think I pulled something, I groaned, wincing as I faked a back injury. It was the perfect cover to avoid any physical contact for a few days. Alice seemed concerned but didn't question it. On Monday morning, I called her at work. Hey, I said, keeping my tone casual. Just a heads up, I've got to leave for a business trip tomorrow. I'll be out of town until Friday. Okay, she replied, sounding a little surprised but not suspicious. That evening, she made another attempt to initiate intimacy. Maybe we can squeeze in some fun before you leave, she hinted. Sorry, I said, shaking my head and grimacing. Still too sore from the stairs. Alice looked disappointed, but I didn't care. I was done playing along. I just needed time to plan my next move and unravel the full extent of the lies that had torn my life apart. I was playing the long game now. Alice's attempts to manipulate me had become nothing more than background noise. On Tuesday morning, she kissed me goodbye at the door, suitcase in hand, fully convinced I was heading out on a 3-day business trip. She had no idea what I was really planning. After leaving the house, I drove to the office as usual, but by mid-afternoon, my priorities had shifted. At 3 p.m., I found myself parked just a block from our house, laptop balanced on my lap. I logged in and entered the access code Nelson had provided, activating the live feed from the surveillance cameras. It wasn't long before Alice appeared on screen. I heard her voice, light and playful as she spoke into the phone. I'll be home by 6. See you then, she chirped. That cheerful tone made my stomach churn. I slammed the laptop shut, disgusted but resolute. I wasn't going to let my emotions steer me off course. Picking up my phone, I called Jack McAdam, my attorney. Have the divorce papers ready to serve by Thursday, I instructed, giving him precise details on how I wanted everything handled. Jack paused for a moment before saying, this approach will cost more than the usual process. Are you sure? I don't care, I replied without hesitation. Whatever it costs, I want this to be unforgettable for Alice. I was willing to pay any price to make her feel the weight of what she'd done. That evening, instead of stewing at home, I decided to distract myself. I ended up at a bar downtown. Sitting quietly at a table, I was caught off guard when a woman approached me and smiled. "Come dance with me," she said, pulling me to the floor. As the music pulsed around us, she glanced up and added, "Don't get the wrong idea. I'm not looking for anything. I just love to dance, and you were sitting there like you needed a reason to get up." Her name was Megan. After the dance, she introduced me to her friends, Jessica and Nicole. We spent the rest of the evening laughing, dancing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of normalcy. By 10:30, I decided to call it a night. Megan gave me a warm smile as I stood to leave. "Maybe we'll see you around," she said casually. I nodded and walked out, feeling a bit lighter than I had in days. But that calm didn't last long. The next day, I was back to business. I reviewed more footage from the cameras, this time capturing Alice's activities in painful clarity. The video was straightforward, no embellishment or drama, just a cold record of her and her companions. Yet, what caught my attention most was not the acts themselves, but her demeanor. She wasn't mocking me or trash-talking me, which somehow made it worse. The only time I came up in conversation was when one of the men suggested meeting more often. Alice shut the idea down immediately. "Rob comes first," she said, almost like a reflex. "I can't just disappear whenever I want." That didn't feel like loyalty. It felt more like damage control, as if she were just managing the logistics of her double life. It was practical, not emotional, a calculated way to avoid suspicion. On Thursday morning, everything came to a head. At precisely 9 a.m., the front door opened, and two men stepped outside. Alice followed, standing in the doorway, smiling as they turned to say goodbye. That's when the process server appeared out of nowhere, stepping neatly into view. He handed the divorce papers directly to Alice with a polite, "You've been served," before turning on his heel and walking away without a second glance. Alice froze, stunned, her smile vanishing as she stared after him in shock. Her companions stood awkwardly beside her, just as caught off guard. I couldn't help myself. I pulled up in front of the house, honked the horn, and gave Alice a cheerful wave before driving off. Her face was ashen, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dread. I didn't stick around to see what she'd do next. By the time I got to work, I felt oddly calm. The game had shifted, and now it was her turn to face the truth. I told my secretary, Nancy, about the situation. "Don't put through any calls from Alice," I instructed firmly. "And if she shows up, just tell her I'm out meeting a client." Nancy nodded but returned a few minutes later with an idea. "I spoke to Victoria at the front desk," she said. "If your wife comes by, she'll call me so you can sneak out the side door and wait at the cafe until she's gone." I was surprised by her initiative. "Thank you," I said sincerely. A good secretary really is invaluable. The rest of the day went smoothly. I threw myself into work, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety in the back of my mind. By the end of the afternoon, I didn't have anywhere else I needed to be, so I packed up and prepared to leave. Nancy stopped by with one last update. "Your wife called 5 times this morning," she informed me. I told her each time that I couldn't put her through. "She hasn't called since noon, I think she's finally gotten the message." "Thanks, Nancy," I replied before heading out. It was around 7 p.m. when I walked into the lobby. Victoria had already gone for the evening, but Frank, the night watchman, greeted me with a grin. "Hot date with the missus tonight," he teased. I shook my head. "No, Frank. We're getting a divorce, and she's not taking it well." Frank's smile faltered. "Ah, sorry to hear that, man." I shrugged and made my way to the parking lot, only to spot Alice waiting near my car. She paced back and forth, her frustration visible even from a distance. Not wanting a confrontation, I turned around and decided to grab dinner at a nearby restaurant. Halfway through my meal, I saw her walk up to the building and press the intercom. A few moments later, she returned to her car and drove off, likely after hearing Frank's message. Satisfied that she was gone, I took my time finishing dinner and lingered over a cup of coffee. Afterward, I headed to a bar nearby for a couple of beers. The atmosphere was lively, a live band played upbeat tunes, and the dance floor was crowded. Several women gave me inviting smiles, clearly looking for dance partners, but I wasn't in the mood. I just sat at the bar, sipping my beer and letting the music wash over me. After 2 drinks, I decided to call it a night and returned to my motel. I parked my car and rented a cheap vehicle from Avis under an alias for added anonymity. I wasn't taking any chances. Back at the motel, I spent the afternoon by the pool with a book, keeping my phone powered off. When I finally turned it on before dinner, there were 9 missed messages from Alice. I didn't bother listening to a single one. I deleted them all. That evening, I returned to the bar, where the band was still playing. The place was packed, and I barely managed to find a seat. I sipped my beer quietly, tuning out the noise around me. The ache of betrayal hadn't faded, but at least here, surrounded by strangers and music, I could momentarily push it aside. As I sat at the bar, lost in thought, I felt a gentle tug on my shirt. Turning around, I saw Megan smiling at me. "Come on," she said playfully. "3 beautiful women sitting here alone, and you haven't come over to say hi." I chuckled, glancing over at her and her friends. "I'm surprised you don't have guys swarming you already." Megan laughed. "Oh, we get plenty of attention. It's just that most of them are idiots. They see the wedding rings and assume we're here to cheat. They don't get it, we're just here to dance." Jessica chimed in, flashing a friendly smile. "Decent ones like you are rare. That's why you've got an open invitation to join us anytime." I hesitated for a moment, then asked, "It's not really my business, but why are 3 gorgeous married women spending time in a place like this?" They exchanged glances, clearly weighing how much to say. After a brief pause, I decided to be upfront. "I handed my wife divorce papers yesterday and left my wedding ring where she could find it." Megan raised an eyebrow. "So, does that mean you're free to pursue something new?" "Not at all," I replied firmly. "The grounds were infidelity. I'm not going to do anything that could give her leverage in a countersuit." Jessica gave me a knowing look and nodded. "Fair enough. But at least now we've got a reliable dance partner." The night flew by as we danced until closing time. Occasionally, other men approached, trying to join us, but the 3 women seemed uninterested and stuck by me. For the first time in days, I felt a semblance of lightness, as if I'd reclaimed a small piece of myself. However, the calm didn't last long. Later that night, as I headed to my car, I found Alice standing beside it. Her face was a storm of emotion, anger, sadness, desperation. When I unlocked the door, she tried to open it and get inside. I stepped forward, gently but firmly pushing her aside. She stumbled slightly before regaining her balance. I rolled down the window and kept my voice steady. "Alice, you need to read the letter that came with the divorce papers. I'm not going to talk to you without my attorney present. From now on, any conversation we have will only be about the divorce." Her face contorted with frustration. "I don't want a divorce," she cried. "I don't want to lose you, I love you." I didn't flinch. "It's too late for that." Alice's voice broke as she tried again, but I didn't stick around to listen. I drove away, leaving her standing there in the parking lot. The next day, things escalated further. Around mid-afternoon, I was walking to my car when 2 unfamiliar men intercepted me. They were young and tough-looking, with a cocky air about them. "You're coming with us," one of them said. "Alice wants to talk to you." Since you're being difficult, we're here to make sure you listen. My first instinct was to fight. They didn't seem to expect much resistance from someone in a suit and tie, but they clearly underestimated me. If I acted fast enough, I could probably make enough of a scene to draw attention. But then I hesitated. If Alice was desperate enough to send these two after me, what else might she try? If I sent them back to her bruised and battered, things could spiral out of control even faster. Before I could decide on my next move, they shoved me roughly into the back of my own car and slid in beside me. My mind raced, calculating my next steps. This situation was getting more dangerous than I'd anticipated, and I needed to stay one step ahead. Alice's voice trembled, as though she expected sympathy. I've struggled with nymphomania, she confessed. It started after prom night, after you took my purity. I've had these needs ever since. I scoffed, shaking my head in disbelief. Alice, there are treatments for that. You could have gotten help instead of lying and cheating for over a decade. She shook her head, her eyes wide and pleading. I tried the medications, they don't work for me. My therapist says the only solution is to have as many lovers as necessary to maintain my mental health. If you can't accept that, you're free to leave with nothing. But I think we can still make this work. She slid a document across the table and handed me a pen. Sign it, she said calmly. I stared at her, incredulous. You're out of your mind, Alice, I said, my voice low and steady. You really think I'm going to agree to this? Before she could reply, the two men who had dragged me here earlier stepped closer, their posture threatening. It was clear they were ready to enforce her demands. I realized there was no reasoning with any of them, and I'd have to act quickly. I made my move, catching the first man off guard with a powerful blow to the side of his head. He crumpled to the floor instantly. The second man hesitated, his confidence wavering. I took advantage of the moment, landing a swift punch to his jaw, followed by a hard kick to his groin. He collapsed with a groan, writhing in pain. Without a word, I grabbed my briefcase and headed for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached it, Alice's voice rang out, sharp and panicked. Stop, or I'll shoot. I froze, turning slowly to see her holding a gun, her hands shaking. My fists clenched instinctively, adrenaline surging through my veins. I was furious, but I knew I had to stay calm. Are you serious, Alice? You've really lost it now, I said, keeping my voice steady. What's your plan here? You think the police are going to believe whatever story you've cooked up? She lifted her chin defiantly. They'll believe me when I tell them you broke into my house and attacked my friends out of jealousy. It's your word against ours. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Oh, Alice, you're as delusional as ever. You think you can spin this? You really believe that Frank and Ruth, the witnesses who saw your goons drag me out of work, won't testify against you? I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. You might fool the cops for a night, maybe even scare a few people, but once the evidence comes out and the witnesses testify, you'll be the one behind bars. And trust me, you won't be able to charm your way out of that. Alice faltered, her bravado slipping as the weight of my words hit her. The gun lowered slightly, and I saw the fear begin to creep into her eyes. I held her gaze a moment longer before turning and walking away, knowing this battle wasn't over, but I had just won the first major round. I'm not bailing you out, I told Alice, my voice cold and final. When the police arrived that night, Alice stuck to her plan, trying to spin a web of lies. She and her accomplices, Gustav and Ryan, claimed I had attacked them unprovoked. But the witnesses I had mentioned, Frank and Ruth, had already given their statements. The police weren't buying her story. By Monday morning, during my bail hearing, Alice walked into the courthouse looking smug, clearly expecting to gloat over my predicament. But her expression shifted to shock when officers approached and arrested her on the spot. That evening, warrants were issued for Gustav and Ryan, who were both taken into custody. Alice's parents couldn't afford her bail, and I made it clear that I wouldn't be helping her either. When her lawyer called to suggest using our house as collateral, I hung up without saying a word. I had no intention of letting her drag me down any further. I returned to the motel, packed my things, and checked out. By the next day, I was back in the house, my house, finally free from the toxic presence that had haunted me for too long. The legal process moved quickly from there. With solid evidence and witness testimony, Alice's defense crumbled. Though she avoided harsher charges through a plea deal, the judge sentenced her to 9 months in county jail and 1,000 hours of community service. With Alice behind bars, the divorce proceeded without a hitch. Aside from transferring 20% of the house's equity to her bank account, a small price to pay, there were no further complications. Once everything was finalized, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was free. Truly free. To mark the start of my new life, I decided to celebrate. I returned to the bar near the motel, the one where I had spent those early nights sorting through my pain. To my surprise, Megan and Nicole were there again, laughing and dancing. Megan spotted me and waved enthusiastically. "Back for round 2, she teased with a playful grin. "You've got me figured out," I replied, holding out my hand. She took it without hesitation, and I led her to the dance floor. As the music washed over us, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time in a long while, I was no longer weighed down by betrayal and heartbreak. I was moving forward, finally leaving the pain behind and stepping into something new.